Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event this evening. My name is Mark Ingberg, and I'm the Associate Dean here at the Morgridge College of Education. And on behalf of Dean Karen Riley, I want to welcome you all to tonight's event, How to Lead in an Uncertain and Complex World. Here at Morgridge, we're committed to inclusive excellence in promoting through our research, our teaching, and our service values around equity and social justice. And tonight's event really represents our commitment to serving the public good. So I want to especially thank Dr. Shields for being here this evening. We're honored to have you. As many of you know, Dr. Shields is a professor and former dean of education at Wayne State University and in Detroit, Michigan, which is a very fond place for me. She has written over 12 books, hundreds of articles, and spoken in numerous different countries, always addressing the provision of academically excellent, inclusive, equitable, and socially just learning environments for all students. As I'm sure many of you are familiar, her book, Transformative Leadership in Education, Equitable and Socially Just Change in an Uncertain and Complex World, is now in its second edition. And we're very happy to say that we will have copies in the back of the room that will be available for all of you. And my understanding is Dr. Shields has graciously agreed to sign them and personalize them for all of you. So it's an honor. I also want to introduce tonight's facilitator, Dr. Christina Hesbel, who's one of our assistant professors in educational leadership and policy studies here at Morgridge. She teaches a number of courses, including courses in doctoral leadership and research methodology courses. Her teaching, her research, her many presentations and publications and service all coalesce around the impact of school and district leadership as praxis in guiding inclusive systems of learners with social and organizational contexts that are central to her focus. Her professional work is filtered through the intersecting issues of social justice, systems thinking, and leadership for sustainable improvement. So we're really happy to have Dr. Hesbel, who's going to be facilitating our roundtable discussion tonight. And so I'm going to hand the mic to her. And again, welcome all of you to tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ingberg. Thank you for being here with us tonight. And thank you, audience, for joining us. We're really delighted to have Dr. Carolyn Shields and a wonderful panel that we'll spend some time with, and then we will certainly open it up to conversation with the audience as well. It's a privilege to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Carolyn Shields. I've known her as a colleague at the University of Illinois, as well as a scholar who continues to inspire my work as well as that of my students. Her singular focus on issues of socially just leadership continues to be inspiring. She has worked directly with one of our doctoral students in particular in his role as the assistant superintendent of elementary schools in the Denver public schools. Once he read her article, which many of our students do, Dialogic Leadership for Social Justice, Overcoming Pathologies of Silence, he approached the superintendent, asked to develop an innovative transformative leadership group of low-performing schools, and along with their leadership teams, applied principles that he had learned from her writing to ensure access to best instructional practice for every student. Her distinguished service as an instructor is reflected in the annual Conference on Poverty that she developed when she first arrived at Wayne State University and chaired that. This meeting had a low-cost registration fee and encouraged educators, both regionally, nationally, and globally, to synergistically come together in order to share success stories, to learn about disrupting low learning expectations that have been traditionally held for children living in poverty. As Mark mentioned, her contribution to the professional scholarship is stellar, including 5 single-authored books, 4 co-authored books, 3 edited books, 28 single-authored book chapters, 11 co-authored book chapters, 48 peer-reviewed journal articles, 60 non-refereed journal articles, 114 refereed non-invited presentations. She continues to conduct workshops internationally for practitioners in their schools and in their districts, and has organized symposia that includes the work of many of her students. She has served as the Dean of the School of Education at Wayne State University, and as the department head at both the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in their Department of Educational Organization and Leadership, and at the Department of Educational Studies at the University of British Columbia. During her distinguished career, she has chaired internal promotion and tenure committees. She has served as an external reviewer for the promotion and tenure evaluation of some of the field's most distinguished scholars, and she has served as a faculty mentor through PhD and EDD dissertations. So why Carolyn Shields? Well, given the challenges that are facing P20 education in our country today, including the increasing demands that are placed specifically on our nation's schools, the need for transformative leadership has never been greater. It's precisely this challenge on which Dr. Shields has focused her own transformative leadership theory and application. She's focused the intentional opportunity for educational and instructional leaders to develop courage, to expand their frameworks and address their own assumptions and biases. Her scholarship lives close to the nexus of PK-12 schools and higher education, is grounded in a solid theoretical base with deep potential for impact in an applied context. Her focus is on transformative leadership, and with thanks also to Paula Frady, disrupting structural barriers and developing organizational processes that empower schools and those working within them to meet the ancillary challenges. She infuses the practical challenges of generating solutions while facilitating constructive change and is equally comfortable in either setting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Shields.
That was longer than my speech. Thank you. Well, Dr. Heswell asked me to spend a few minutes introducing myself and the trajectory and transformative leadership. And so I've just jotted down a few notes. That I want to start by talking about my first year of teaching when I was teaching in Labrador, which is on the northeast coast of Canada, as you may know. So I was teaching 7th grade French. I don't know if I told this story the last time I was here. Did I? Do you recognize it? And Sonny was a kid who sat at the back of the room with his hair over his face. He wouldn't answer a question. He wouldn't participate. He never did his homework. I cajoled. I pleaded. I threatened. I yelled at him. I gave him detentions, and nothing worked. And finally, one day, in total frustration, I said, fine, if you won't work here, come to the house after school, and we'll do French there. And to my surprise, he came. And as we sat at the dining room table, conjugating avoir and être, he suddenly blurted out, I just found out that my mother was married Saturday. And gradually, he told me about his life. He had lived in a small house in a neighboring town, and his mother got involved with a man who really hated him and sent him out to live in a shack behind the house in the middle of a Labrador winter. No electricity, no lights. And social services found him and brought him down to the residence of the school where I was teaching. It was a Granville Mission school. And what Sonny taught me was how silly we are to think that kids can put aside all of the baggage that they live with, all of the concerns in their daily lives, and focus on what we want them to learn in our schools and classrooms. And so that importance of relationships, the importance of establishing a climate of trust, of welcome, of safety, I think began there. And then I went, and my first academic position was at the University of Utah. And because I'd been very involved for 20 years teaching in K-12 schools, I wanted to stay connected to schools. And so I got involved with schools on the Navajo Reservation, did some professional development with them, and worked as a critical friend for quite a while. While I was there, I met so many teachers who wanted to go and help the poor little Navajo. And I met a teacher when I was doing some interviews at one point, and I said, what would help? What would make a difference to these kids? And her response was, better parents. And so again, the experience there reminded me of the importance of high expectations, the importance of not having a a missionary attitude of failing to recognize the capacity of these kids, and especially the importance of rejecting deficit thinking and blame and taking responsibility ourselves for the learning of all our students. And I'm quite sure that some of you may ask, why do we need another leadership theory? Well, too bad I can't see the slide. There are a whole lot of theories, as you know, and many of them focus on traits of leaders, which have really been proven not to be very successful. The process theories, which many of you, I'm sure, have been involved with, distributed leadership, servant leadership, all of the kinds of different processes that we can use. And some goal-oriented theories, where you focus on instructional leadership. But it seems to me that the current theories have not focused explicitly on equity. And when I read a book by Oakes and Rogers, 2006, called Learning Power, they make the case that we've had decades of educational reform that hasn't really produced much change. And they argue that there's no reason to think it would. If we focus on technical reform, we're going to get technical change. And so their premise is that we need equity-based reform if we want to have more equity in our schools. And so I think another reason for another leadership theory is that none of them really combine the emphasis on traits and processes and goals. And finally, which is the beliefs, values, and assumptions that undergird the actions and goals. Now, through all of this, I need to acknowledge that I grew up with a pretty privileged background. The pictures there are my grandparents. Whoops. My grandfather was a banker, chairman of the local school board. My grandmother was a university graduate, one of the first from the University of Toronto. Both my parents were university graduates. But it took me a long time to recognize my privilege and to acknowledge it. And partly to acknowledge that with privilege comes great responsibility. And so all of these things are tied up in transformative leadership. Come on. When I started as a faculty member, I was working, as I said, at the University of Utah, focusing on equity and leadership. And I had colleagues who told me that social justice has nothing to do with educational leadership. It's just really fringe. I had an academic colleague when I went to the University of British Columbia who said, ethics has nothing to do with educational administration. But I decided to persist. And through the 90s, the term social justice came to mean everything and nothing. And so you could say, I'm segregating kids on the basis of special needs because that's socially just. Or you could say, we have to mainstream kids and integrate them on the basis of, regardless of their needs, because that's socially just. And so because it was co-opted and everybody used the term, I tried to find a theory that was more robust. And so I looked to the work of people like, James McGregor Burns, who in 1978 wrote a book called Leadership. I'll say more about that one later. The work of William Foster, who was one of the early critical theorists and leaders in our field who focused on social justice. The work of Quantz, Rogers, and Dantley, and many others who used the term transformative leadership. But they also used the term, in the 90s, transformational leadership. And yet the two theories are really very distinctly different. And there are many other scholars, and some of them I'll mention in a few minutes. James McGregor Burns, in his 1978 book, Leadership, talks about transactional leadership and transforming leadership. And from transforming leadership have developed both transformative leadership through the work largely of Ken Leithwood and Bassanovolio and some of those scholars, and transformative leadership using Freire, Wiener, Shields, and others. And it's not surprising that originally, and sometimes still, they're confused because the dictionary says that transformational and transformative are synonyms. But in educational theory, they're absolutely not. And so what I've done here is give you the tenets of transformational leadership on the left, where Ken Leithwood says that there are 4 main areas: setting directions, developing people, managing the instructional program, and redesigning the organization. Those are all processes, but they're neutral processes in a sense. And there is a debate in education, and certainly in educational leadership, about whether theories should be normative or neutral, non-directional. My argument is, again with Oakes and Rogers, that if we want to have equity, if we want to have improved inclusion and a socially just school and society, then we need to give people some guidance as to the direction of those processes. And so on this side, I've got the 8 tenets of transformative leadership. And so, obviously, we need to set directions. But transformative leadership is explicit about the direction. It has to be deep and equitable change. Of course we develop people, but how do we do that? One of the things we have to do first is deconstruct knowledge frameworks that perpetuate inequity and reconstruct them in equitable ways. There's a poster that I love that I often use when I'm doing professional development. It says, "Don't believe everything you think." And we've been taught to think things that really are not true. All you have to do is turn on the TV news these days and you get lots of examples of it. I think that Burns was talking about transformative leadership and not transformational leadership. And I make my case by quoting once from his 1978 book, in which he calls for a revolution, a complete and pervasive transformation of the entire social system. There's an explicit direction there. And in his 2003 book, Transforming Leadership, he says that leadership is a response to the billions of the world's people in the direst want. Again, the focus of transformative leadership. I probably should have said that I consider transformative leadership to be a critical theory. Michael Dantley, in one of his articles in 2004, calls it critical transformative leadership. But I think it's inherently critical because it focuses on those who are marginalized, oppressed, excluded. And that's the definition of a critical theory of leadership. So based on all the reading I've done, the hundreds of different articles, I've tried to pull together the key ideas from their articles into a theory of transformative leadership. So those are the 8 tenets. I'm not going to go through them all because I know many of you know them, have read the book or books. But just let me focus on a couple. So that this notion of deconstructing and reconstructing knowledge frameworks, of addressing beliefs and values and assumptions, is too easy to skip over. Very few theories talk about it, although there's a lot of research that talks about how important beliefs are. Because if you don't address things like deficit thinking, implicit bias, racism, homophobia, it doesn't matter what new series of texts you use, what new structures you put in leadership in the school, you're still not going to have an equitable, inclusive learning environment for kids. And I remind you that kids don't choose their circumstances. They don't choose to be poor. They don't choose to be gay. They don't choose to be bullied. But all of those things affect their ability to succeed. I had a doctoral student defend his thesis in which he used transformative leadership at the end as through abductive reasoning. And one of the members of his committee, who's much more of a quantitative scholar than a qualitative, said, okay, if transformative leadership is a theory, what makes it a theory? What are the variables that predict what outcomes? Kind of through him. Well, what phenomenon does the theory of transformative leadership explain? What are the variables? Or can we talk in those terms? What does it explain? And many people will say a good theory is always under revision. Certainly Thomas Kuhn thought that. I argue that there are basically two assumptions that transformative leadership has. The first I've identified several times. It's this sense that if a child doesn't feel included, valued, respected, then it's unlikely that they're going to be able to concentrate and succeed. So on the one hand, creating a more inclusive, excellent, socially just, and equitable learning environment will, and I've seen this time and time again in my research, create better academic outcomes without having to focus on test scores. On the other hand, and Mark alluded to this at the beginning, one of the tenets of transformative leadership is the need to balance public good with private good with public good. We tend far too often to focus on the individual, on the private good of education. You know, stay in school, your lifetime earnings will be greater. Stay in school, you'll get a better job. But we forget the civic goals of schooling. And so the other assumption is that if we really focus on the tenets that deal with emancipation, democracy, interconnectedness, then we're going to create's not a very good verb, foster more civically minded people who have learned how to become participants in a fully democratic civil society. And so those variables, it seems to me, we're not talking cause and effect, but are related to a stronger democracy for all of us. And so those are some ideas that I wanted to share with you. The notion of a theory I hadn't been asked until about a month ago. So, and as I was thinking about it, I knew immediately how I wanted him to answer. And he did not too bad a job. This is a model that I've developed of transformative leadership. I don't expect that you can read the details, but if you start with an unequal school and you decide you need to change, the issue is that it's constant. It's never finished. People like Giroux talk about democratizing and democratization instead of democracy to represent that notion that democracy is always unfinished. And if we're going to strive to get there, Judith Green talks about democracy as having mutual benefit. It's not one person, one vote when the majority can run roughshod over the rights of the minority. But we have to work for the mutual benefit of all. And to do that is a constant challenge. I won't stop there. I moved this slide. Nelson Mandela says that education is the greatest weapon we have to change the world. And I absolutely agree with him, but only if we focus on educating all kids equitably and not just some. And to help you remember that it's transformative and not transformational, I always like to think of transformative rhyming with live, because it really is a way of life as much as it is an educational leadership theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shields. Certainly giving us some things to think about as we go on with the work that we all do. So we are honored tonight to have panelists who have elected to come to spend some time with us this evening and to pose some really provocative, thoughtful questions for Dr. Shields. And she will discuss those questions, respond to the panelists, and then we'd really like to open it up to the audience and have you pose questions that you're wondering about as well. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Breitich. Sarah is a graduate of the ALPS program with a PhD, and she has served as an adjunct faculty member in the department. Several of you in the audience have had her as an instructor, using Dr. Shields' book besides. So welcome, Sarah. We also have Dr. Doris Candelari. Dr. Doris Candelari is also a graduate of the program with a PhD from the ALPS department. She is currently a professor in the department. She's a clinical assistant professor in ALPS. So she's going to be able to pose a question. And then we have Mohsen Alzarani. And Mohsen is a first-year doctoral student in our doctoral program. He is from Egypt, and he has a really interesting global question that he'll pose as well. So let's begin. Let's begin with Dr. Breitich.
This is on. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for coming and for sharing this with us. It's really exciting to get to have you here. And having taught your book this summer, it was particularly exciting to get to speak with you. So the question I was thinking about, and I have had some time to think about your work, is as you're continuing to do this research and developing this theory, and I love that it is very much alive, could you talk a little bit about what you feel are the greatest challenges facing transformative leaders in practice, and what, in your experience, are some of the best practices for overcoming them?
Well, I think the practitioners with whom I work would say that the greatest challenge is pushback from people who are reluctant to change, who don't want to recognize their own implicit bias, the sense that it's hard to acknowledge deficit thinking. I sometimes ask teachers to think about a child who's not succeeding and to brainstorm the reasons why. I learned this from a Maori colleague in New Zealand who was talking about transformative leadership. And he then asked them to analyze their responses, because you know what teachers say. Well, the kids don't care, the parents don't care, they don't do their homework, there's no place, it's too noisy at home, there's all sorts of things. And he asks them to analyze the responses in terms of whether the onus is being placed on the child and the family, or the system. The class is too big, I just don't have time, I don't have the right resources. Or whether the educators are taking responsibility themselves. I'm just not sure how to teach kids who are refugees, or how to teach kids from this particular language group. And you might not be surprised to learn that 80% of the responses put the blame and the onus on the children and the families. And another 80 to 85%. And another 10 to 15 put it on the system. And only about 5% of the responses relate to the educator taking responsibility themselves. And so I often find that people are, when introduced to that term deficit thinking, say, yeah, I've heard people talking like that, but I didn't have a term for it before. It's given them language. So I think one of the most important things is helping educators to see that and to take responsibility. A former student who was a principal here in Denver for some time used a strategy of free writing with her staff all the time. And so she would ask them, well, why are the African American kids whose first language is English not succeeding as well as the Latino kids whose second language is English? And she'd ask them to write their answers and then to share the papers, and it would form the basis for a staff discussion. And what I think I've learned is that we can't just do one single professional development about social justice. It's not an inoculation like a vaccination. It has to be constantly kept in front of the staff. So making it a priority, looking at data. Why are these kids succeeding and these kids not when their family background is the same? The same principal had a group of teachers who said, well, whenever she raised a question, they'd say, well, this parent doesn't care, or this parent's mentally ill, or this parent's in jail. And what this principal always did was find a Caucasian parent or a child whose background was similar, so that they couldn't use that as an excuse. And I think overcoming the excuses is so important and probably the biggest challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great question, a practical question for us to consider. And thank you for your thoughtful response, Dr. Shields. Dr. Candelaria.
Yes, so thank you very much. As those of you in the audience know that are in our program, this is the basis of our educational leadership program in developing school leaders, the certificate program as well as the master's program. And so as I think about, my original question was around the difference between transformational, because it's used so widely. People throw around that term so easily. So rather than focus on the difference, because you spent such detailed time on that, I'm curious about any advice that you have for leaders who wish to lead transformatively, yet find themselves constrained by the larger systems in which they lead.
One of the things that Wiener, who's a scholar who writes about Paulo Freire when he was Secretary of Education in Brazil, reminds us of is that a transformative leader has to have a foot in both camps. That you can't get to a leadership position in our systems without paying attention to the status quo, without having been successful. If you're too disruptive, you don't get to be a leader in the system. And so it's kind of a schizophrenic place to be, to try and be a transformative leader.
I've been there.
Me too, in the current systems. So I think my advice, and when I teach a doctoral class, I always start with Sun Tzu's The Art of War, even though I don't think this is necessarily war, but maybe it is. And he basically says two things that I think are important. One is know the hill that you want to die on, right? And always leave the enemy, his term, an escape route. And I think that's really good advice when you're trying to be a transformative leader. And you can't expect everybody to fall in line right away. You know, the change theory would tell us to start with early adopters and bring people on as they see that something works. I have my students write journals, and I just read 30 of them last night. And some of them are basically saying, but they don't get it, and there's so much pushback. And I remember when I was a young assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, I go home in tears. They just don't get it. But I think if you just relax and keep the data in front of people and keep raising issues, they do get it. But I think you have to preserve your job, or you can't be that effective either.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. I think I was confused between transformative and transformational leadership. But my question is, like, transformative leadership theory has been attacked for placing a huge emphasis on the heroic aspects of leadership, which I think comes at the expense of the followers. How would you respond to this argument?
I'm going to backtrack. When I was a young assistant professor, I was at a conference where Ken Leithwood, who really is one of certainly in educational leadership, a guru of transformational leadership, he was presenting kind of a retrospective of his life work and research. And I sort of timidly from the back of the room asked him if it was right that transformational leadership focused entirely on what happens within an organization, whereas transformative leadership, as I've explained it, looks at the material realities of kids in society and tries to change them. And his response was, Absolutely, because it's the only thing you can change. And so that focus within the organization, I think, does put a heavy emphasis on the leaders. Charisma, and it used to be one of the aspects of transformational leadership, although in recent years he's taken it out. So I think transformational leadership emphasizes the single leader more. When I talk about transformative leadership, I talk about leaders in whatever place they are. Community members, teachers, parents, caretakers. It takes all of us. And no theory is pure. And so there's obviously an aspect of transformative leadership that requires distributed leadership. You have to share it. You can't change a system by yourself. It has to require something about servant leadership because you're focusing on those that are the least advantaged and in the direst want, as Burns would say. And so a lot of the processes of other theories are subsumed in transformative leadership, but it's the equity goals that are explicit that makes it different.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mohsen, for your question, and Dr. Shields for your responses. So it's time now to open the floor to questions from people who have taken the time to join us tonight. Thank you, Kayleen. Please introduce yourself. And give us...
My name is Victoria. I am a PhD student at Morgridge College of Education. Thank you for sharing your ideas with us. The question that I have is, in your opinion, how can a teacher develop transformative leadership skills in students and these skills in themselves?
There are a number of scholars that talk about the need to develop critical thinking, what Freire would call conscientization. I always have trouble saying that word. And I think that that's how teachers need to do it. The two curriculum theorists that I really like are Bill Pinar and Madeline Grummett. And they both define curriculum not as texts or algorithms or standards, but Grummett would say as conversation. Bill Pinar says it's complicated conversation. Grummett says it's the conversation that makes sense of things. And I think that's the starting point for teachers. Too often teachers save the conversation for the end if there's time, and engage in what Freire calls the banking model, where we deposit information into the heads of kids, which doesn't really work. And so one of the things that tenets 6 and 7 talk about in transformative leadership is the need for emancipation, democracy, interconnectedness, global awareness. And I think kids today don't have a clue about the rest of the world and how what happens here influences the rest of the world and what happens elsewhere influences us. And I think we have to be much more aware of those things. There's a wonderful article that I use that Bill Bigelow wrote, and part of it he's talking about teaching a group of middle schoolers about the world, and he gives them a soccer ball, and he says, just write about the soccer ball. And if you want, you can come and look at it, you could touch it, but just write about it. And the first iteration, they all write about it having black and white leather hexagons or whatever the shape is that a soccer ball has. And so then he stops, and he makes them come and look at it. And there's one hexagon that says made in Pakistan. And then he reads a poem about building the pyramids, and it basically talks about how the workers never get any credit, and yet the hours of labor that was put into building the pyramids. And he asks the kids to write a new paragraph about the soccer ball. And then they get stories about the kids sewing them and needles pricking their fingers, but they don't have time to play soccer, and they don't even know what it's for, and just becoming aware. As we read that story one night in class, I had a student in a master's class who was in the curriculum office of their district, and she said, but if we teach kids about these things, they won't even enjoy shopping anymore. And I thought, wait a minute, is that our goal in this society, is to have kids enjoy shopping? So even just having them look at the labels in their clothing, know where things come from, and understanding the interaction is so important, and how complex it is. Because I had another doctoral student whose father was from India. And when they were talking about child labor in one of her master's classes, and she tried to say, you know, for some families, having a child work in a factory puts food on the table and a roof over the family's head, keeps them out of prostitution, and allows the other children to go to school. And in many families where they rotate it, some children at least get some schooling while the others are working. And so what she was trying to say is it's not as complex as just boycotting something made in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh, but trying to understand the whole complexity of it. And that's really hard to do, but I think it's really important. Conversation, curriculum as conversation, I think is the key.
Hi, Dr. Shields. Thank you again for being here. This is great. My name is Lisa B. Buck. I'm an EDD student, second year here in the ALPS program. And I'm wondering, in your travels and your work, and I don't have the current edition, so maybe it's in there, but I'd really like to know what you're seeing community-wise, and maybe specific leader-wise, out there as far as what's working, who's actually applying transformative leadership, and why is it working?
Well, one of the big concerns we've had in education for some time is what's commonly called the achievement gap. That's one of the things that No Child Left Behind was supposed to address, and the reiteration of it, Every Child Succeeds, is supposed to address. And one of the things transformative leadership does is think about it more as an opportunity gap, or better still, an empowerment gap, so that it's an issue of power. And if we don't redistribute power more equitably, then it's hard to see how we'll ever address the achievement gap. So that's why I think it's working, is because it actually has the impact that we want and focusing on the long-term learning and acceptance and respect and valuing of everybody, rather than just focusing on test scores. And I think that's really important. One of the things that, as I was interviewing principals in high poverty, highly diverse schools, and we'd ask them, well, what do you think leadership for social justice means? They tended to all say, it means helping every child succeed. And that's just a starting point. That's really narrow. And so a wonderful doctoral student who was with me one day said, well, what would social justice leadership look like if you were in an upper middle class, more homogeneous school? And the principal kind of looked at her, scratched his head, and kind of said, well, I guess those kids would have problems too. And we started asking that question, and that was the typical answer. They identified it with addressing kids' problems instead of this sense of global awareness and recognizing that things like poverty are socially constructed and we can all understand it and do something about it. And so I think because it really does address those underlying assumptions and the knowledge base, I think that's what's working. The strategies that work are really just, and it sounds so simple, people want more strategies, but it's really just talking about it. It's not shying away when you see kids being bullied, or when there's the issue of a transgender kid not being allowed to use the bathroom of the gender with which they identify. And all of those things that are critical social issues that we have to address in schools, because everybody pays taxes and school is for everybody, and every child and every parent has the right to be respected and valued. I don't know if that answers enough, but it's a start. And I'm just going to add something. With the increase of charter schools and private schools, some people have the luxury of choosing a school that can discriminate on the basis of religious values or beliefs. And because that seems to be growing, it seems to me that it's really, really important for public schools to be inclusive and to address those things so that we have some sort of countervailing values in society.
Thank you, Dr. Shields, for being here. This is transformative for myself.
Thank you.
My name is Chris Williams. Excuse me. I'm a fourth-year PhD in curriculum and instruction with a cognate and critical race theory.
Awesome.
I'm currently putting together a professional development for teachers and pre-service teachers that addresses the preconceptions and the misconceptions of children of color. My question to you is, I'm having a hard time getting this past white people, specifically white educators, because they take on that that I'm not a racist. It's always about being called a racist. And it's not, it's that
Racism
white fragility.
without racists, yep.
Yeah. It's with white fragility that, that causes this, I believe. You can hit one teacher at a time, but what do you do when this whole educational system has racial bias and doesn't do anything about it? For instance, George Washington High School here in Denver, they don't have professional developments of equity and diversity. A lot of universities are not educating their teacher, pre-service teachers. So how besides me trying to put together this, as soon as I mention it, they're like, oh, here she comes with this Black Power thing, and it's like, it's not like that. You just need to understand what it is and recognize it when you see it.
It's not an easy issue. And I don't know many answers except that you do what you can in the sphere in which you work. But we obviously need more transformative leaders who are working in the policy arena. Because if states and accrediting bodies required social justice, anti-racism education as part of teacher education, universities would teach it. And so changing the requirements is something that we need to be working on. You probably need a white ally. I hate to say that. But that's why we need to be in it together. Beverly Tatum has a really interesting article, which is the stages almost of grief that white people go through as they become conscious of their role in perpetuating racism. That may be a good place to start with white educators. I've used the CNN series. Some of you may have seen it where they, Anderson Cooper and I've forgotten her name, somebody else from CNN, ask a whole bunch of kids. It's a modern version of the doll experiments, and they've got pictures of kids. And they ask, you can find them on YouTube, and they ask, point to the smart child, point to the dumb child, point to the child you'd like to be friends with, point to the angry child. And what's really interesting about that series is that, well, first of all, the hands go really fast. So the positives are all the light kids and the negatives are all the dark kids, and both African American children and Caucasian children have the same response. But the series also has parents watching the children respond and then asks the parents about the responses. And there's one mother in one clip that I use who basically justifies her daughter's responses because she says, well, that dark face, you can't even see the features on it. But there's another mother who's been a first grade or a second grade teacher for years, and she says, I've spent my career trying to teach kids to be tolerant, and now I have to deal with my own son. And I think some of those videos that deal with Caucasian teachers and kids may be a good starting point as well. I use them when I'm doing professional development often.
Hi, buenas noches, Dr. Shields and everybody on the panel. Hello. My name is Andrew Fox. I'm a second-year PhD student in the ELPS department, and my question revolves around advice. Transformative leadership is subject to implementation science, specifically around implementation dips. And I'm just wondering what kind of advice you have for practitioners and folks that are using transformative leadership but are in the periods of it not gaining traction. Thank you.
Well, Michael Fullen would say that all change is subject to an implementation dip, and all change is accompanied by anxiety, whether it's change you want, like getting married or graduating, or change you don't want. And I think having people understand that that's normal is a starting point, that you need to persist. But again, finding allies, building coalitions, working with a small group first and showing others that it can make a difference is the best advice I can give. Don't give up, but think small in a way, in the sense that you're not going to have a whole staff. Now, the principal I talked about who had been here when she was in a different state, had a huge backlash from teachers at one point, and they said, we're doing the best we can. We can't do any better. And so the principal threatened, I guess is a good word, to have a banner made and to put it over the door of the school. And the banner was going to say, if you're a Caucasian family, you can expect that 95% of your kids will meet or exceed expectations. If you're a Latino family, you can expect that 80% of your kids will meet or exceed. And African American kids, 65% will meet or exceed. And the teacher said, you can't do that. And she said, if that's the best we can do, parents have a right to know what to expect. And of course, she really wasn't planning to do it, but she was making a point that we have to figure out how to address the needs of all kids. And so sometimes maybe a little bit of coercion with a bit of humor thrown in can also help.
Thank you for that question, Andy. And I think it's a great way to end our conversation, our formal part of our conversation tonight. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you very much, Dr. Shields, for being with us and sharing time tonight. Thank you all for coming in the midst of all of the crazy schedules that you have in your lives to make time for to be able to join us tonight. And we have a little something on behalf of the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies Department to thank you for being here. We do have refreshments. And Dr. Shields has agreed to, as you heard, to autograph any books that you might want to purchase while you're here. So thank you all, and Dr. Shields, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.